So we're going to talk about the next category, and that is sans serif. Now, I love sans serif typefaces. I think a lot of people love sans serif typefaces. They're basically make up a lot of different types of fonts and typefaces that we use today. What does sans serif mean? Well, sans serif, that means without serif in French. They lack those little serif details that we saw in the previous typefaces, and they're much more modern in appearance. Now, there are 4 main classifications of sans serif typefaces. Let's get into that. So let's get into the first one. The first one is called grotesque. What a name, right? Grotesques are the earliest and include fonts like Franklin Gothic and Accidents Grotesque. Really nice typefaces. What we got here is Source Sans Pro, which is a really great grotesque typeface. Their letter forms are pretty similar to some serif typefaces, kind of minusing the serifs. So you'll see a little bit more contrast between the strokes. So there is some thick and thin contrast here, but they just have no serif at the end of the letter forms. Next, we have neo-grotesque. Now this includes some of the most common typefaces like Arial, Universe, and everyone's favorite, Helvetica. Now, when I'm comparing this to, say, something like a grotesque typeface, the one thing I'm looking at is that the neo-grotesque is much more plain in comparison. You'll see that it's much more uniform within the typeface. There's less contrast between thick and thin. Definitely a good comparison between these two. Now, the third is humanist typefaces. Now, this includes Gill Sans, which we're actually using right here, Frutiger, and Tahoma. They're much more calligraphic than other sans serif typefaces, that's for sure. You're probably wondering, what exactly does that mean? So let's take a look. Notice how they have greater variation between different line widths. You'll see that right here in the A, you'll see them in the S, just in the T, you'll see them in the U. So there's definitely much more contrast between different types of line widths. You'll also notice that they're, little swooping A, kind of like it almost has a serif. The little swoop on the T is kind of just arching a little bit more up than we'll see in something like neo-grotesque like Helvetica. And lastly, we have geometric. Now, these are probably my favorite. And this includes Futura, which is an amazing font, and Proxima Nova. Now, geometric sans serifs are more closely based on geometric shapes. What gave that away? If you look at the O, that is definitely just a circle. You can see it even reflected in other letters, like individual letters like C and E. The T is just like a straight stick. Let's compare that to like Gill Sans, where there's that swoop. So that's very calligraphic. If we look at something like neo-grotesque, even though they're very plain in appearance, you'll see that there is a little swoop there. There is a little bit more life to this typeface. This is just like 2 sticks put together. Almost looks like a cross there. And that G is very circular. You'll notice, like I said, in the O's, very circular. It's always very simple. So now that you know all the different types of categories and classifications for sans serif typefaces, there's some really interesting ways we can use them. And we're going to jump into Figma next.